Welcome and good evening, everybody. My name is Miley Panerio-Langer. I am the Associate Director with Friends of the Blue Hills, and I really want to take time to welcome you to tonight's talk with Michelle Wu on a Green New Deal for Boston. Tonight's talk is part of our lecture series, the Our Climate Crisis, Research for Action and Change, sponsored by the Blue Hills Climate Action Coalition. Our coalition is made up of local community-based organizations that you can see here on the slide, who are working together to engage and to inform our members, as well as the larger community, about climate change and about ways that we can all get involved to address the crisis and the threat that is posed by climate change. Tonight's lecture is co-sponsored by everyone here, so the Blue Hills Observatory, Brookwood Community Farm, Blue Hills Trailside Museum, Canton Residents for a Sustainable, Equitable Future, the Eleanor Cabot Bradley Estate, Friends of the Blue Hills, Mary May Binney Wakefield Arboretum, Mass Audubon, the Milton Public Library, Neponset River Watershed Association, Sustainable Milton, Quincy Climate Action Network, and the Trustees of Reservation. We have this series because we are really hoping to keep people engaged, especially during this pandemic, and especially because we have critical climate issues, and we wanted to give folks a ways to become involved and tools we could use. We started off the series at the Sunrise Movement, and we heard from the youth about the exciting work that they're doing. We also heard from Rebecca Hurst from the Sustainable Solutions Lab about how climate change is and will affect historically marginalized communities. We also heard from folks from the Four River residents against the compressor station and about their environmental justice advocacy work. And earlier this month, we heard from UMass biology professor Rick Caselli, as he talked to us, and we learned a lot about how the biodiversity within the Blue Hills is and will continue to change due to climate change. All of the previous previous talks are recorded and are posted on the Blue Hills Climate Action website and Facebook page. Looking ahead to next month, we will be joined on Thursday, January 7th at 6:30 p.m. with the Mass Power Forward movement as they discuss climate legislation, what's new, and what you can do. I really hope you join us. Just a little bit of housekeeping. You can chat to us as panelists. But let's keep that to things that are, errors or things you need help with. We have a Q&A option available for you. So if you have a burning question or if you want Michelle to answer something later, please put that in the Q&A. It's a lot easier for us to keep track of your questions, and we really want to answer as much as possible. So chat for problems, Q&A for things you want to know and hear more about. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Mark Smith, Executive Director of the Mary May Binney Wakefield Arboretum. Mark.
Thank you, Maylee. It is my privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, Boston City Councilor Michelle Wu, who will talk with us about the important role municipalities will play in the fight for a livable planet. Michelle Wu has served as Boston City Councilor at large for the last 7 years, representing the entire city of Boston as the first Asian American woman to be elected to the council, and the first woman of color ever to serve as City Council President. Earlier this year, Michelle laid out a bold vision to bring the sweeping call for a Green New Deal to our beloved city of Boston. In her report titled, Planning for a Boston Green New Deal and Just Recovery, Michelle lays out a comprehensive 15-point plan that combats the ramifications of climate change and its intersecting issues, ranging from affordable housing and economic opportunity to transportation and racial justice. In a recent Boston Globe article, Michelle said this of her report, and I quote, "This is most fundamentally about the fact that no particular policy program or office or individual can do this. It's really about a mass public conversation and community mobilization that prioritizes what project should happen, where, when, and what the details are." So tonight, I am pleased to introduce my neighbor from Roslindale, Michelle Wu.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be with you all. I'm grateful to have the chance to engage in this conversation. I'm grateful to be with leaders who are doing so much to steward our incredibly important local natural resources. My family and I spend a lot of time in the Blue Hills as well as our sort of escape close to home. So I'm looking forward to the conversation and the Q&A about any of that, whether it's this policy or what you all are doing locally in terms of conservation awareness and making sure that we are doing all we can to protect what we have. I want to thank also my new policy director, Tali Robbins, who is going to be making sure that the slides line up with what we're saying. And what we're going to try to do is to zip through the formal presentation as quickly as possible so that we can save more of the time for dialogue and back and forth. But I figured what we could do was talk a little bit about general principles and the crisis at hand, which is preaching to the choir, I know, with this group. But the framing of why we need to even have a report like this and why we need to be pushing a Green New Deal for Boston, and then diving into what it means to take action at the municipal level. Okay, so the first slide is way too many words that basically summarize how we can take action locally when it comes to climate justice. We're often struck with this feeling of paralysis, I think, because climate and what's happening in terms of our ocean sea levels and temperatures, it's just such a global system, right? Even larger than what happens at the state or national level. This is really an international conversation about our future as the human race. And so what I want to emphasize is that, yes, that is very big. That is why it is so important and so critical to take action together and to collaborate. But we also need to localize not only the impacts, but localize the agency, our ability to act as well. And so in Boston, we have done things like pass a local Wetlands Protection Act, which empowers our Conservation Commission to push for resilient green development. We, 3 years ago, I'm proud to say, introduced the order to push for community choice energy, municipal aggregation that would provide a seamless way for residents and small businesses to increase our sourcing of renewable energy above and beyond the state minimums. And we are now right about to see that implemented in Boston. We have done things that seem small, such as removing barriers for electric vehicle charging at homes that are part of condo associations. We have banned single-use plastic bags. We're pushing the conversation around fossil fuel divestment. We have also passed a food justice ordinance that attaches requirements for food purchasing, largely applying to Boston Public Schools, but recognizing just how important it is to localize all the impacts and focus on the ways in which we should be putting our money where our mouth is when it comes to climate justice and food justice as well. Okay, I'm gonna go to the next slide. And so we're taking some actions now, right? And certainly this is not enough. This is a scene from before everyone was masked up and we could still have large scale events. This is the youth climate strike on Boston City Hall Plaza. This was a incredibly well-attended but powerful youth-led organization, mass organization to draw attention to the fact that Boston, in concert with cities around the world, would call urgency into policymakers' priorities. We know as of the October 2018 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC report laid out that we have just 12 years left as of 2018 to make sure that our emissions were curbed below the level of warming so that we could still survive and thrive on this planet, kicking above that 2.5 degrees Celsius threshold, pushing us into a spiral of food insecurity, poverty, insect-borne viruses and pandemics, drought, loss of the ability to live on much of the world. And so that 12-year window, already now 2 years into it, just a decade left for us to take action and to take action right here at the local level. So I want to, the next couple slides show a little bit about what it means to do nothing, right? We sometimes in government just realize that the easiest thing you can do is to ruffle no feathers, right? To any policy step that you introduce, any new change inevitably results in opposition, particularly from folks who are benefiting from or tied into the status quo. And that means that oftentimes the easiest course of action is to just preserve that status quo. But we really need to continue emphasizing that we see all around, especially here in New England, especially in Boston, that the cost of doing nothing is tremendous. We are already right in the middle of devastating climate impacts that are not just harming our public health, but our ability to commute to work, our ability to have emergency vehicles reach people, our ability to work outdoors when the temperature is rising every single summer. And we know where those burdens lie, right? They lie on the same communities that have borne the brunt of COVID-19, almost every aspect of this pandemic, sitting on Black and Brown communities, from the public health crisis to the economic crisis to the communities who are excluded from relief. And the climate crisis was already reinforcing and setting the conditions for this pandemic to hit that hard. So I think we have one more slide on, this is East Boston, this is Dorchester, Morrissey Boulevard, right? A major thoroughfare in the city where high tide every couple of months halts traffic, right? You'll see cars slowing to a crawl, going up on the sidewalk, as I think that's me, yes. This is when we visited a couple weeks ago, and I was just trying to cross the street to get to the other side. And in just that few minute span of trying to wade through the water, seeing ambulances stopped, police, motorcycles needing to come up and over, and we are still, just a few years away from it becoming worse and worse and worse. And what's more important, I think, to point out, even than the sort of tangible physical evidence of our vulnerability, is our social vulnerability, right? Climate change and the impacts of our climate crisis will reinforce every aspect of disparities across the city. Boston is a city and a metro area with tremendous resources, right? Some of the most well-resourced and advanced expertise, healthcare, biotech, financial sector, and yet we are one of the most segregated cities. We are one of the most unequal cities. And you see the map of social vulnerability is mapped exactly onto where the geographic areas of the city are that are most climate vulnerable, whether to urban heat island effect, flooding from sea level rise, or from stormwater, or from precipitation. Okay, so this part, what are we gonna do about it? I wanna first mention that the report came about as a way to complement advocacy for the federal Green New Deal, right? This framework put forward by our very own Senator Ed Markey and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez that lays out an ambitious, urgent plan to ensure that we are making a transition to 100% renewable, green, carbon-free economy and society, and tapping into the jobs that would come out of that. So we at the Boston City Council passed a resolution in support of that, right? We weighed in officially, but we wanted to do more. And it's important to ensure that, as loud as we are about supporting the federal Green New Deal, we have to recognize that if every major city in the country stood up and decided to take the steps within municipal power to move forward with climate justice, we would solve a good part of the climate crisis, because not only do we have the ability to make sweeping change with densely populated areas, such concentration of economic activity, but this is where the climate impacts come from as well. This is where we are generating emissions. This is where, if we can implement the parameters, the social resiliency, the climate and structural changes to close the racial wealth gap and ensure that we are truly building a city for everyone, we will see sweeping change across the entire country and be a good deal of the way through this climate crisis. So, okay, we can go to the next slide, Tali. So to do that, we, and I want to shout out the lead author of this report, Nina Schlegel, who worked with my office several years ago to create a climate justice analysis of all of the city of Boston's climate policies up until that point, and then returned to spend about a year and a half helping to write, research, coordinate this report, working with national experts and so many of our local activists, local experts who have been doing this work of building community around justice. So we start with principles first and foremost, because we are creating a framework that should guide not only the specific steps that would be taken, but who gets to be a part of shaping those steps, whose voices matter in this decision-making process. So, we'll put the link to the report. You could read the entire 60-page document if you wish, but to quickly, run through these, thinking about systems change as change that is people-centered, right? Rooted in not the numbers around what feels possible for budgets or for businesses, corporations to be, to mitigate their impact, but what is right for the residents and the people and families in our community. Second is democratic and participatory. We cannot get to systems change unless we are changing whose voices are shaping that, and therefore really connecting the decision-making and the policies to communities most impacted. As our amazing Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley says all the time, the people closest to the pain should be closest to the power. And we really want that to guide our climate justice and all policy efforts. Third, true systems change must get at root causes, not just manage the symptoms, not just provide Band-Aids and immediate relief, but really connect our efforts to long-term foundational root causes. 4 is that it should be rights-based, right? So not a frame of who should be paying for the ability to have a functioning public transit system because the users must pay their fair share, but we have the right to clean air from getting cars off the road. We have the right to mobility and having everyone in our community benefit from the opportunities in our city and our region because we're able to physically get to those places and physically connect to those opportunities. So thinking from that rights-based model of what are the basic guarantees that every single person deserves from a human rights and civil rights perspective, that shapes how we think about our policies and how to fund them and how to prioritize them. 5th is decommodifying society and nature. We often hold concepts that are in conflict with each other, right? Housing is a good example. We both talk about housing as something that is a fundamental right for people to have a safe, healthy, affordable roof over their head. And yet we then allow housing to be traded as a commodity on the market for people and companies to make tremendous amounts of profit off of that. And those two items fundamentally are in tension with each other. How do we try to expand public housing and think about not just the market impacts of our behavior, but really what are we trying to do in creating access to things that are basic, our natural resources and these rights, human rights that everyone deserves. 6th is social and ecological resilience, right? We want to make sure that systems, I hear it sounds like the 3-year-old's banging on the door. I think I'll be okay for now. Social and ecological resilience, ensuring that our natural systems are being repaired and are being returned to, from the damage that we've done to them. And finally, justice-oriented, from procedural justice, economic justice, every bit of our system change should be oriented around bending that arc and what makes for a pathway to solving all of these issues together. Okay, so really honing in on what can cities do? Because the main point of this report is that there is so much at the local level that is right within our power. So this is an overview of what cities control that are impactful, not just for climate justice, but in general for every policy issue. Budgets, zoning, money that cities are spending and putting out into the economy to contract for goods and services, employment, municipal assets, and the ability to control and therefore affect the design and emissions of buildings and spaces, taxation, local legislation, of course, incentives for development, incentives for companies to locate in different places, and then advocacy, the role of cities and city government to stand up for what is needed at the state and federal level as well. Okay, so the meat of this report, the sort of heart of what we're trying to demonstrate is that the ability to create justice, the ability to move forward with a Green New Deal and a recovery from this pandemic really centers on an interconnected set of issues that we can take action on. So I will just read through this list quickly because the font is a little small, but we can talk through more of these in Q&A, or you can read through the report. But the idea is that this represents not just what one might think of as your typical climate initiatives, right? Decarbonization and sea level rise and urban tree canopy, but many more aspects that are needed for climate justice, housing justice, small businesses, et cetera. So accelerating decarbonization, right? We need to move faster than the goals that we have currently committed to as a Commonwealth and as a city. Right now we are on paper targeting 2050 in a lot of cases, getting to decarbonize a net zero economy and city by 2050, a carbon-free city, means that we would have a 50-50 chance of hitting those thresholds, you know, as a society and as a planet. We really need to be moving that far forward and setting up milestones along the way. So we talk about not just moving that carbon-free city threshold up to 2040, but having a fully clean electricity grid by 2030, and then having a fully clean municipal carbon footprint by 2024. Justice audit and framework. So if we talk about structural change, the place we have to start is evaluating the structures of city government, the very entity that through our public dollars, through all of our tax revenues and what we chip in to do the things that we can't accomplish as individuals or through other sectors, you know, government, we need to be sure that our city agencies, our decisions, in fact, are not maybe unintentionally or through force of status quo, perpetuating inequities and perpetuating injustices. So really going through and auditing from that perspective, what should happen. Clean energy financing through programs like municipal bonds and PACE, green workforce development program, divesting from fossil fuels, private prisons, harmful industries, and reinvesting in a climate just future. An urban climate core, which the City Council just had a hearing on recently, but the idea of taking that model from the original New Deal and creating a mechanism and a training force for some of these other projects to be accomplished, you know, on the residential side and on the commercial side. Decommodifying housing through cooperative housing and community land trusts, renters' right to counsel, similarly emphasizing the need for housing justice as part of a Green New Deal. Just and resilient development, right, moving towards concepts like an affordable green overlay district through our zoning code that would require every decision about building to be aligned with our climate needs as well as our social justice needs, the need for affordability in the greater Boston area. resilient stormwater infrastructure through changing our fee structure and planning at a district level, transportation justice, right, ensuring that we are building out multimodal options, improving reliability and service, and moving to fare-free public transportation. An equitable small business recovery is part of climate justice, particularly our what are called MWBEs, minority and women business enterprises, our businesses owned by people of color and by women, so hard hit during this pandemic. How are we ensuring that we're aligning our procurement and technical assistance and other city resources to support these very businesses? Food justice, we have a whole separate food justice plan that Tali helped author, building out this point, but recognizing the whole range of injustices that are rife throughout our food supply chains, how central they are to every person's survival and health and sense of community, and lots that the city can do on that front. Growing our urban tree canopy, right? Trees are these miraculous carbon sinks and mental health improvers and shade providers, and just about every issue that we struggle with regards to climate change, trees help. And so really ensuring that we are doing all we can, particularly from an equity lens, to measure, build up, and maintain our urban tree canopy. And then last, but one of my favorites, a local Blue New Deal, meaning really thinking about our role as a coastal city to tap into the resources available along the coast and the responsibilities we have to preserve a living coastline and think about the impacts of sea level rise, but also recognizing the opportunities from wind energy and the jobs that could come with that, from regenerative ocean farming and the ability to draw carbon down into the ocean with certain types of crops that could also then contribute to sustainable food systems. Anyway, we can get into all that. There's pages and pages in the report on this. So you can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is the wrap up. You know, big picture, we often talk about this window of keeping emissions low as sort of 3 big steps, right? 1 is electrify everything. 2 is clean all the sources of electricity. And then 3 is really rethink our land use patterns and affecting the consumption of energy, right? How do we localize everything so that our food doesn't need to be shipped in from, you know, internationally or even from out of state, but that we're really providing pathways to food access, to job access, where people don't have to incur tremendous emissions from transportation. And we're really providing everything we need in walkable, sustainable, resilient, vibrant communities. So much of that, you know, step 1, 2, 3 really does lie at the local level in how we're setting the parameters by which we make trade-offs and decisions as a community as to what can be developed here, whether we keep open space or turn it into an urban farm or put up a building with affordable housing. How are we engaging in these conversations that the city gets to control, but that the entire community should really set the terms for? So ultimately, this Green New Deal and Just Recovery Plan, as Mark was referencing in the beginning, is about policy change, but specifically and sort of throughout in a more fundamental way, it is about democratization and really ensuring we are connecting every community, every individual in our communities to the ability to shape our collective future. I know that Boston and our entire region has what we need. We have the resources, we have the activism, we have the ideas. We just need bold, urgent leadership that really frames our city and our community as a shared, you know, as a shared stake in the same place. We will get to what we need to do when every community sees other communities' fights as their own. And so a Green New Deal is ultimately about mobilizing that shared interaction, interconnection. And I'm grateful for the chance to build this movement together alongside you all and to hear more about what's on your minds about this issue or anything else. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Michelle. That was a lot packed into 20 minutes. That's a lot of information for us to think about and chew on. There's a couple questions in the Q&A room. So if folks do have a question, I'm going to start my video now. If folks do have a question, please use the Q&A function as opposed to the chat room. Although I do see a question in the chat room, which I will get to. So the first question, Michelle, comes from Tucker, who says that East Boston and Chelsea residents are fighting Eversource's proposed high voltage electrical substation in an inappropriate, dangerous location. Now, the Weymouth compressor station is going online now to bring fracked gas across our state through vulnerable communities. How can mayors, municipalities, and residents block these dangerous and unjust projects now?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for lifting up these two just horrible, just the impacts that we're introducing to communities who are already bearing the brunt of so much of our industrial uses, of our environmental hazards. Now, in the midst of a pandemic where we have seen just how much the vulnerability of being exposed to air pollution and other hazards continues to create generational impacts, it's just an incredibly unjust decision, but also incredibly short-sighted as well. Right? One of my big frustrations is that we often see reports from the state and city level about how we are going to get to these major thresholds of 2050 or carbon-free economy and city. And we're building in the need to, for example, retrofit so many of our buildings in Boston. Our buildings account for 71% of emissions within the city of Boston. And then transportation accounts for about 29%. So that's the bulk of it right there. But we know that to hit our goals, we will need to have net zero buildings. And yet we are still, through our city power, allowing for new buildings to be built every single day right now that will need to be retrofitted shortly thereafter to hit our goals. And so it's kind of, at what point are we really going to say, now the clock actually starts? The East Boston substation is one of the, I think, most stark examples of the cost of doing nothing and the cost of delay, right? So in fact, the mayor had the ability to stop this project. There are various levels of permissions required, and one is clearance by the city's Conservation Commission, right? The members who are appointed by the mayor and are essentially a function of the executive power. About a year ago, actually almost exactly a year ago, the Boston City Council passed an ordinance that I had authored along with my colleague, Councilor Matt O'Malley, called the Local Wetlands Protection Act. This is about much more than just wetlands, but it builds on the provision within state law that allows municipalities to exercise additional oversight and control over areas that have natural resource area value, including wetlands, but including other areas that can help absorb the force of flooding or maintain cooling in the midst of an urban heat island. So it drastically expanded the power of the Boston Conservation Commission, and we passed it in December 2019, and the Conservation Commission needed some time to promulgate the specific regulations that would lay out, how many feet is the buffer zone? What are the exact requirements that they will impose on developers? Before December 2019, we had been fighting for this ordinance to pass for years, right? The city has committed to doing it since at least 2014. We began in earnest to start to push and to work in 2017, again, after some major flooding in the city. And there was a lot of resistance from the administration to passing something that would so drastically change how developers could function through our permitting process. And because we didn't then pass it until December of last year, because the specific regulations were not promulgated in time, the Conservation Commission did not have the authority to specifically block what they otherwise would have been able to block with the ordinance's power. And so it is just a tragedy that reinforces the urgency of taking action now. This is a place where local authorities could have made a difference. I have a lot more to say about the politics behind all of that, which I will keep to a more political forum. But there are a lot of financial interests that are very much intertwined with decisions such as these that show up in our political and fundraising systems, that show up in our campaign systems. And so we need to have leadership that is clear about, again, people-centered systems change, about underlying root causes. By every one of those metrics, both of these projects would have been blocked. And it's frustrating to see that we are having to mobilize again and again to make sure that we're at least getting on the record about it. But we need much more urgent change on these types of projects.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Next question from Celeste is, this is fantastic, exclamation point. Thank you, Councilwoman Wu. I just moved to Boston from Miami, and I love seeing that you're thinking of resilient stormwater and a local Blue New Deal. Could you please talk more about the local Blue New Deal? Is this related to the proposed federal Blue Carbon for Our Planet Act that sets the framework for carbon sequestration research from seagrass beds, meadows, and other coastal ecosystems?
Yeah, so the expert on this is Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, who is the author of the federal Blue New Deal. And we took a lot of portions from that, but the idea is that, or the general principle is that we usually spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to run away from or block the ocean, right? We're worrying about sea level rise, and so building up barriers or retreating from the water. And when in fact, like every other aspect of the Green New Deal, it's a switch in mindset when we think about co-benefits instead. We're not just trying to avoid harms. We're really missing out currently on the opportunity to tap into tremendous potential for jobs, for public health, for resiliency, and for opportunities for the next generation. So the Blue New Deal kind of asks the question, right? What if Dorchester and East Boston and our immediate coastal neighborhoods and even further inland, what if we had the same kind of relationship to the water as Gloucester did, right? Where it was a kind of central economic force that holds the community together. And we have that potential, not just to have better transportation mechanisms and recreational means, but also to think about the jobs that come from ocean farming, that come from wind energy and offshore wind. There are many ways in which we can move, to not just mitigate, but lean in. And so if you are interested in that, we would love to put together more details on and building out that one as well. There are a couple marine biology and other ocean experts who are leaning in. So would love to include you too.
Here's a question that might refer to that, and that is, are you planning committees for each of these 15 points or principles? You have already done a lot of work, so do you have committees set up already? And maybe there's an interest in how can people get involved in any one of these 15 areas? That
would be amazing. So to generate this report, we've worked very closely with many of our local advocacy organizations who, in fact, we just had another kind of climate justice focused brainstorm strategy session earlier today. But whether it's through Sunrise or 358 Mass or Right to the City, there are lots of groups that have weighed in and that we want to continue to work with and mobilize. We are setting up, I hadn't thought about doing it sort of point by point out of the 15, but we're setting up different committees to focus on bigger picture buckets, whether it's related to the planning side of things, housing, public health, the educational side. So I think maybe the best way is I'll put my email in the chat, or maybe if Tali could put my email in the chat. It's just michelle@michelleforboston.com. Please reach out, and we would love to plug you in to our policy efforts. There's just limitless potential for Boston to really be a national leader on these issues. And so when we're generating ideas, when we are working with other cities and building on them, we can really shape the trajectory of momentum, not just around the country, but in other cities around the country, but pushing up then to the federal level and what will happen after inauguration with the new administration.
Great. Andrea has a question about how to change building codes and to improve efficiency. You mentioned that a little bit, and also around transportation. What's your thoughts about how to make Boston a bicycling city, bicycling friendly city?
Yeah. So the building codes sit at to tweak the specifics of the standard of building codes that our city agencies enforce. It is a state level issue, and so it would be an effort that I know some climate and labor groups are coming together on to try to influence. There are small provisions in terms of how these codes are interpreted or enforced that can happen at the local level as well. But a lot of the local discretion lies more in regulations around issuing the permits for development in the first place. The Boston Planning and Development Agency has a resiliency checklist that we are pushing through the local wetlands protection ordinance to be a more mandatory format of that. But yeah, building codes are generally at the state level. In terms of, sorry, what was the other question, Mark?
Around cycling, e-bike, yes. How to make the city the capital of cycling in the United States.
Yeah, I have to confess that as of, I don't know, I'll say when I first joined the council, as of 7 or so years ago, I had not been on a bike in a very, very long time, right? Probably since I was a teenager. I, like many, believe that Boston's streets just simply could not accommodate it because they are, originally cow paths and winding and everything so dense and historic. And then I had the chance to go on a climate study tour to several cities in Northern Europe and seeing how the exact same density, historic nature was just, it opened my eyes up completely to be visiting Copenhagen and Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and to know what a big difference it makes. I think we assume here that there's only a certain demographic of people bike, right? There's sort of stereotypes about cyclists being usually wealthier, white, able to sort of have all the gear that you need to be an urban cyclist. But in fact, that is a function of, to the extent that is true, it is a function of design decisions and infrastructure choices that cities have made to make it unsafe for the vast majority of people to ride, except for those who can afford to have, extra gear and to be equipped for that. And so when we have a system that relies on human error between large multi-ton vehicles and individual people on bicycles, that system will never be safe. It will never be equitable. And so we really have to just make that first shift to, this is not about blaming individuals. This is not at all about individual decisions or skills driving or safety or whatever. It is about whether we choose to build infrastructure that separates different modes of transportation, right? That cars should have no ability to be near and collide with cyclists or pedestrians. Protected cycle tracks, investing in pedestrian infrastructure. I think this is some of the best money that we could spend as a city in terms of meeting our climate goals. And in fact, there are such local experts, such experts locally who have already told us exactly what we need to do. Peter Firth over at Northeastern is a professor who has analyzed all of the streets of Boston from a scale of, what he calls his low stress cycling network scale. So it takes into account the fact that you may have a road that has some quote unquote bicycle infrastructure on it that's in fact feels much less safe than a road that technically doesn't have any infrastructure on it, right? You think about American Legion Highway with a bike lane painted on it, or Washington Street with a bike lane painted on it with a stripe, versus a quieter residential side street that might not have anything painted, but just you're less exposed to vehicles zooming by. And so every street in the city, he has coded on this stress category from 1 to 5. And when you see those numbers and the color coding of that, you see where the pathways abruptly cut off. So from many neighborhoods in the city, particularly lower income neighborhoods, particularly communities of color, there is no direct low stress network pathway to get to where the job centers are. And so it's about honing in on the specific intersections and connection points that we would then open up the entire network. And we have all the information to tell us what we need to do there. And then the other piece that goes hand in hand with that is around access to and reliability of our bus system, right? In Rosendale, we were one of the first beneficiaries of the city's program to start ramping up dedicated bus lanes. These lanes are, in fact, not just for buses, but for cyclists as well. And so when you think about design decisions such as giving up a lane of parking, even if it's temporarily for that 4 hours of the morning commute inbound, and then 4 hours on the other side of the street during the afternoon commute, well, back, when people are commuting again at some point in the future, maybe. This is a tremendous improvement in terms of cyclist safety as well. Our MBTA bus drivers are very well trained in terms of how to interact with bikes, and just having buses and bikes alone in that one lane means that we are removing the chance of conflict between bikes weaving in and out on shared spaces with single-use vehicles, single occupancy vehicles. So the two go hand in hand, and that is also how we think about equity in our transportation access across the city as too.
Great, thank you. Lee asks, state agencies like MassDOT, MBTA, and DCR have a tendency to do things the way they've done them for many, many years. They're starting to come around, but also seem limited by resources. How can the city influence these agencies to change their ways and be more responsive to changing needs and better align with the Green New Deal for Boston?
Yeah, I mean, so I do think, in the presentation earlier, there was a line, a point about the importance of cities as advocates to state and federal government. And I do think that there is a whole lot more that Boston could be standing up for. We often do not have a unified response when it comes to pushing back on the MBTA. I think we saw a little bit more of that with this most recent round of proposed service cuts, but there are many, many issues where Boston and City Hall could be speaking out much more loudly. For example, around the development of West Station in Alston, and MassDOT's decision to wait until 2040 or later to bring that commuter rail station online, when for the entire sort of western part of our immediate suburbs, this would give people the ability to not have to be driving on I-90 and instead be on public transportation. Decisions around the red-blue connector, or other low-hanging fruit about expanding the Orange Line past Forest Hills, further down the Needham Heights commuter rail line could be changed to an expansion of the Orange Line as rapid transit. So anyway, there are a lot of things that the city, just by being more proactive and forceful, would have an impact, would force the state to respond. But even more importantly, when individual cities do that, it goes so far. But when cities band together, and say, as a region, Cambridge, Somerville, Brookline, all of our surrounding municipalities, we are going to the State House together, whether it's through a home rule petition to legally request this change for our region, or just to advocate for a state law that does this or that, or funding or programming. That has tremendous impact. And then, I do think there is more, even within the city's purview, that through municipal action we could influence, right? Again, the MBTA runs our public transit system, but the city of Boston decides how to allocate street space and whether signals will change to green as they sense public transit vehicles coming, signal prioritization. We have a lot of influence as to where these dedicated bus lanes will be painted next and how quickly and how well maintained. So there's a lot that I think with a focus on mobility, rather than just a separation between the transportation department and a public works department, who does the sidewalks and who does the streets is really sort of the divide right now. We should be thinking about where do people need to go and how do we best serve them getting there, even if that involves other levels of government.
Thank you. These next two questions, I'm going to join them because they're similar, and you touched on this a second ago. Alex asks, what can constituents and residents of surrounding towns do to support this agenda? And Louis asks, what should those of us in surrounding towns be encouraging our leadership to do to work together with Boston?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I love groups that are action oriented. At the end of the day, we want to ensure that this is implemented. So I think a couple observations. First is that often you'll find, especially at the municipal level, especially in Massachusetts, that your policymakers are extremely willing and eager to take on the progressive changes that are needed to bring about a more just, equitable, sustainable society. But given how often the news cycle is driving, action, or given just the sort of fire hose of things that are happening, when you come to your city councilor or mayor or even state representative, your elected official, with a specific proposal to say, could you do this? Instead of just saying, what can you do to advance climate change? But will you support changing to a stormwater fee that is based on permeable surface area rather than just water usage? Will you commit to getting to 30%, 40% tree canopy coverage? That is a different set of conversations. And so we really try to, through this Green New Deal, put out a blueprint where everyone could take pieces as appropriate for cities all around the country to really have some accountability, but also provide the ideas as a starting point. And the other note I will make is that the best time for accountability is election year for politicians. And so there is tremendous impact, and we've seen it already in Boston, not just in approaching your elected officials, but approaching candidates, including when people are running for re-election, to say, will you commit to this, right? Having organizations put out a candidate questionnaire, even if you're not an organization that can get involved politically or make an endorsement, just by doing the public service of getting candidates on the record about issues does shape what the accountability is like after people are elected into office. There have been numerous examples now where grassroots organizations, advocacy groups in Boston for the last few election cycles have asked candidates, yes or no, are you willing to support a face surveillance ban on this racially discriminatory technology? Are you willing to support fare free transportation? And simple yes or no, maybe elaborate if you wish. But then afterwards you see, okay, well, now we actually have a majority of the votes on the council. Let's push this from an organizational point of view and prioritize this. So it's very helpful to put these ideas out and ensure that the people who are running for office are aware of it, are thinking about it, and ideally committing to it as well, and then implementing it. And then, of course, run for office yourselves, right? We know that this window is is closing of how many issues we need to solve. And if you see that the government that's representing you doesn't reflect the urgency of your community, truly consider putting yourself out there and throwing your hat in the ring. It will help shape the conversation and the accountability, and you will have the opportunity to be that partner on the inside in government as well.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn this over to Maylee, but before I do that, I just want to say how inspired I am, and by your vision, by your passion, and by your unwavering commitment to these issues that really will make or break our future. So I want to say thank you for your leadership and encouraging us to move quickly and to move forward. So Maylee, take us away.
Sure. So thank you, Mark, and thank you so much, Michelle, for your presentation. You know, the World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmary. And your presentation and your Q&A really brings home for me this health in all policies approach, this thing that we can do collectively and collaboratively about climate justice and about our lived environment that's so much larger to our health, our fundamental right to health. And so I'm so excited. Thank you so much for your 7 principles and your 15 policies. So again, thank you very much for your presentation tonight. And I just want to acknowledge again that this climate action series is sponsored by the Blue Hills Climate Action Coalition, including the Blue Hills Observatory, Brookwood Community Farm, Blue Hills Trailside Museum, Canton Residents for Sustainable and Equitable Future, Eleanor Cabot Bradley Estate, Friends of the Blue Hills, the Mary May Binney Wakefield Arboretum, Mass Audubon, the Milton Public Library, Neponset River Watershed Association, Sustainable Milton, Quincy Climate Action Network, and the Trustees of Reservations. And just a really quick reminder, our next talk will be on Thursday, January 7th at 7 p.m., where Mass Power Forward will be joining us to talk about climate legislation, what's new, and what you can do. I so hope you can join us. Please look at the webpage and Facebook to register for more information. Thank you so much again, Michelle. It was a pleasure having you tonight. Take care, everybody. Bye.